everybody, to a new episode of RealAg Politics. Yes, we're firing it up again. We're bringing it back. Popular demand. I had people, actually, if you can believe this, people emailing me saying, hey, what happened to RealAg Politics? Well, it is back. We Parliament's returned. We got new session is underway. And, of course, there's lots happening in Ottawa and, of course, in some of the legislatures across the country. And so we're going to try to keep you in tune and in touch with what is happening, how it's impacting agriculture across the country. If you have any feedback, of course, you can always email us, shaney@realagriculture.com. You can find us across all the different social media platforms as Real Agriculture, or you can call the RealAg feedback line, 855-776-6147. Your other option, I guess, in this case, is also to leave your thoughts, your questions in the comment box here on this YouTube broadcast. It is great to be with you here today. We got three great guests lined up and ready to provide us with their perspectives. We've got Debra Conlon. She's a government relations lead with the Grain Farmers of Ontario. Numerous things happening from the grain farmers' perspective. We're going to talk about Bill C-234 and it being at the Ag Committee in the Senate here this week. We're also going to talk to Deb about these fertilizer tariffs coming out of the G20. There was some messaging on maybe we shouldn't be having tariffs on things like fertilizer out of Russia. Will Canada make a bit of a slight change in their strategy as it applies to those fertilizer tariffs? Deb will provide some insight on that. Derek Robinson, he is the CEO of MASH Strategy out of Calgary, Alberta, will be with us. We're going to talk to him about some of the polling that we're seeing between Conservative leader Poilievre and the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. Things have really turned on themselves on their head in the last 3 months. We've seen some real reversals in the popularity and maybe the disapproval of the other. And we'll be joined today also by Dave Carey. Dave is the industry relations, the government relations VP with the CCGA. He's based out of Ottawa. We're also going to talk to him about Bill C-234 from the CCGA's perspective. And we're going to hit on some of the growth and regulatory priorities that CCGA has heading into the winter Parliament session as they talk to different lawmakers, of course, across the city. Looking forward to it. And let's not waste any more time. Let's get to it. We're going to be doing this show every week, by the way, and tall order on top of all the other things we're doing at realagriculture.com. This really allows us to focus on the politics of the day. So let's not spend any more time. Let's get to our first guest. Okay, let's get to it. Up first here on RealAg Politics is Debra Conlon. She is Director of Government Relations with the Grain Farmers of Ontario. Deb, welcome to RealAg Politics.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, important topics here. Let's start with the Bill C-234. Now, this is the bill. We talked a lot about it last spring. This is the private member's bill that would essentially give an exemption to farmers that are faced with the carbon tax, like on grain drying. They would get an exemption for that. Grain drying and other activities as well, heating livestock barns, things like that. I know there's been lots of groups lobbying on the Hill this week. What is the sense of the timelines of getting this through Parliament?
Well, I know that the senators that we're speaking to are really eager to get this through as soon as possible, because they recognize that for grain drying this fall, if it were to pass before this fall, that it would actually have a benefit for our farmers for sure. Whether that's possible or not, you have to look at the experience of even some bills that the government itself put through, like the internet bill that took them 2 years, right? And the Senate passed it back and forth. So it's a very unpredictable area. Timing, that's for sure. I know our goal is to see it get through as soon as possible. This is our third round at this, and we run it not just help farmers this fall, but just make sure it gets through.
Yeah, and winter's coming too, right? So we have grain drying on the fall harvest, but when we get to winter, the people heating livestock barns, they're going to be, that's another where they see a huge increase in cost, and that line item of the carbon tax for sure. Now, this is not a bill that was supported by a lot of Liberals. In fact, Ag Minister Marie-Claude Lebeau voted herself against it at the time. Is there a slow play at work here, or is this just the slow government machine at work?
Well, I mean, I don't have any indication that anyone in particular is trying to slow this down. Every senator that we've spoken to, it has actually been a really refreshing experience at the Senate. There isn't a single senator that we've met with that doesn't have a long list of questions that they want to know the answer to. Um, and we have a video that we have Jeff Barlow on his farm. We take him through the whole harvesting process, and it happened to have been a wet year when we filmed it in December, and show them how a grain dryer works. Every single senator, and we're not talking their staff, they haven't been briefed on it, them individually have watched this video. So, it's really impressive, to be honest, how to watch kind of democracy unfold in this way. It's easy to be cynical in these situations, but it's quite remarkable how interested they are in grain drying.
Yeah. Well, it's a pretty cool process when you see it actually happen. Is there still disappointment that commercial dryers are not included in this exemption? This is only on farm grain dryers that would qualify.
That's right. So, our ask ever since this started, really, I mean, if you go back in time, Ontario had a cap and trade system at the time when the federal government was developing this backstop. And then once we got rid of the cap and trade system in Ontario, then this applied to us. And our message to the federal government, to the provincial government, has always been that this should apply to all farmers wherever they dry their grain. They should not be paying a carbon price when there is no alternative. It doesn't make sense and it penalizes it. So, that's been our ask. And then ideally it should be in the same fashion that the exemption exists for greenhouse, for example, right at the pump, I like to call it, but that's where it should happen because that's the fairest place to have that exemption.
Okay, so just get up to speed on the process. We're waiting for the Senate to do its work, and then what?
Then it goes to the government and becomes a law. I think if you look back though, we had that tax bill that got passed as a private member's bill. It got tossed around a little bit afterwards. So
Right.
at the end of the day, it's up to the government to implement it. But they did implement that one at the end of the day, and our expectation is they would implement this one.
So, Deb, it sounds like you're pretty optimistic about this happening based on interactions with senators. Is there any reason to be cautious about this this bill C-234 being actually killed at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think, last night there was a hearing and there was some groups that were talking about the slippery slope. That it takes away the price signal. When we already know that the government's acknowledged that there's an exemption for greenhouses, so why not extend that to grain drying? I think that that's a message we'll be definitely following up with the senators about. And then there was also a presentation by OABA, the Ontario Agribusiness Association. They're asking for the bill to be expanded, which would ultimately kill the bill from going forward in this session. We have to go right back to the beginning of the process if that happened. And so that's a potential for delaying this and seeing it die on the order paper.
Yeah, everybody I've asked about, leaving, omitting the commercial grain dryers, and challenging people on that. The message back is routinely there's compromise when you're trying to get bipartisan support, especially when it comes to a private member's bill that typically don't have a snowball's chance in hell to go anywhere. This one has, and that was maybe that was a line of compromise. But it's the issue is there's a risk reward here. Trying to change it now, going back to square one. I'm assuming that a lot of producers are going to want to just have an exemption period. Never mind having to start all over again.
Exactly. I think that OABA is losing the plot here, right? The plot should be, how do you support farmers? And the best way to do that is to speak to the government about an exemption, right? Not insert something into a bill that's now on its third round. This is 6 years we've been working on this, and every time we lose just at the last second here because they call an election. When you've got a bill that has not just a couple of liberals supporting it, which is pretty remarkable given they do whip a vote. All of the NDP, which is also remarkable, the Bloc,
Greens.
and Elizabeth May, right?
Yeah.
It's got the support and it could go through. So anything that delays that is not welcome at this time. I think if I was working for big companies in the agribusiness, I would be looking for ways to support farmers on this.
Another topic I know that you've been working on a lot is the fertilizer tariff. It's really impacted producers in the province of Ontario and Eastern Canada on a whole, for that matter. I found it interesting coming out of the G20 in the communique. It mentions that all countries agreed that there shouldn't be restrictions or tariffs on grain or fertilizer, not only coming out of Ukraine, but also Russia was also mentioned. This is a little bit counter to what we've been seeing in Canada in their position. Get us up to speed on where we're at with this tariff and when it was last renewed, and is there an opportunity here that this could change going forward?
So we've worked really hard to make this a point. I mean, you've got the UN, you've got the G20, everyone around the world is saying don't interfere with the production of food. In particular, fertilizer is recognized as an important component of that. That message is not resonating with this federal government that we have today. We've tried everything. I mean, I will give them credit. They did help us get that first year supply in right after they put the tariffs in place, although there were many delays, but they just will not budge on this tariff. At this time, I know one of the companies that was an importer at the time is trying to get back the tariff that they paid because much of that fertilizer that year was in transit and shouldn't have been charged a tariff. They've been successful on a portion of their the tariffs that they paid, and then another portion they're still working on trying to make the case for. This has just been one of the most difficult topics to really break through on. They're pretty passionate at the federal government about this tariff, and including the one on fertilizer. But they did make an exemption for cobalt. There are exemptions, and that was for medical purposes. So you ask yourself, this question is why for medical purposes and not food? I just don't understand why they don't understand the need to solve this. There's many other suppliers in the world that people are dealing with right now, but they're unpredictable. They don't have the relationship, and that is essential, as you know, for grain exports and for imports, right? You can't. An unreliable partner is an unreliable partner, and that in turn means additional costs.
But one thing that's kind of bothered me is the lack of recognition of the nuance here. When I talk to people in the fertilizer industry, fertilizer analysts, people that are in the retail side, they'll tell you that Russian fertilizer is still making its way to Canada. It's just coming through places like the U.S., who does not have a restriction on fertilizer coming out of the country. And so if that's what's happening, to what end are we going through this sort of, I'll call it a bit of a dog and pony show of trying to show support for Ukraine by having this tariff in place? There's lots of ways to support Ukraine. I'm not sure that this is really an effective one. That's been kind of the frustrating piece for me.
It is really frustrating. Yeah, I agree.
Now they renewed it in June. How long does that? Do you know how long that renewal in June stays on for? When that renewal? Because we've heard one person speculated to us that, this is something maybe they just let expire and don't make a big deal about it and say, hey, we haven't renewed it and we're supporting farmers. They just sort of, it goes away. How long does that, if put in place in June, how long does it last for?
So our understanding is right now it is in place until it's not in place anymore. There is no renewal per se. I know there was a renewal period last year, and now it's in place until the government makes a change.
Yeah. Well, hey, Deb, really appreciate you joining us here today on RealAg Politics. Much appreciated, and I'll let you get back to all of your government relations work, trying to get those politicians in line.
Thanks. Take care.
Well, we continue on here on RealAg Politics. Let's talk about some of the mainstream political matters that are happening in the country as well. We have a provincial election underway as well in Manitoba. Joining us right now is the CEO of Mass Strategy. It is Derek Robinson, based in Calgary, Alberta. Derek, great to chat with you.
Mr. Haney, always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's great to see you. Okay, Derek, let's talk about some federal issues. Of course, there's a lot of stuff happening in federal politics right now. We've got the issue with India. We also have the situation when Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, came to the House of Commons and who was on the invite list. We got the speaker stepping down. There's a lot swirling around. So a lot happening in QP here this week. There is no doubt about it. What I want to talk to you about, though, is the polling numbers. We have seen an amazing reversal. I don't know how else to describe it in terms of the polling numbers and the support, the wind of support behind the Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre. Mass Strategy, we should say, was the digital lead on his campaign for the leadership. What's your take on what has happened here, what we've seen over the past 3 months?
It's a seismic shift, Sean. There's no doubt about it. It really seemed to happen around May and June, where it seemed like the Liberals and the Conservatives were sort of still neck and neck a little bit. You could still see Trudeau forming power again if there was an election. And then all of a sudden, there was this dramatic shift where the Conservatives are at least 10 points up in most polls, if not all of them. And then in some polls, they have them way up. So the chances of them winning now, if you kind of look at the seat projections, would have them almost guaranteed to get a minority. And in most cases, actually a pretty substantial majority, which is a little bit shocking. I have a lot of friends who thought, Trudeau's never going away. He's always going to be around. And now it really looks like he's hanging on to power and the support's really fallen out. So there's a lot of reasons for that. I think, the main one when I think about it is there's always issues that keep piling up. So they're piling up. They've been piling up over the years. And they're really starting to impact his brand, which has been a very powerful brand for him in the Liberal Party. But there's been too many shots taken. The walls are starting to crumble a bit on them. Plus, you have a popular leader in Pierre Poilievre, who's definitely made the shift to be more of a moderate leader, a moderate conservative. And you've seen that a lot of his branding and advertising recently.
Yeah, but there's more work. Like some people making fun, like he took off his glasses and all of a sudden he got popular. It makes me think maybe I should get
take off yours.
Maybe I need to get laser eye surgery. People would like me a little bit better. But there's more to it than that. Although I do think the brand change has been positive. When I talk to conservatives that follow and listen to some of the stuff we're doing at RealAgriculture, people have been positive on the change. A little of a softer side. And trying to shed some of that attack dog branding stigma that he has had as he grew up through the ranks. Is it a case of people like Trudeau turning them off and this is where they've turned towards Poilievre, or is there something in the conservative messaging that is saying, you know what, Trudeau's fine, but I actually want to vote for that guy? Do you see the difference?
Yeah. So there needs to be an option for people to start disliking the other leader. So, Trudeau's been somewhat unpopular with most of Canadians. You remember he lost the popular vote in the last 2 elections across the country. So we can't forget that. It's just Aaron O'Toole and Andrew Scheer didn't really have what it took. They never connected with Canadians on a deep level on a lot of deep issues. But it seems like Pierre's really found that message. And I've really seen it get honed in here in the last kind of maybe 6 months, but it's only really started to take shape in the polls over the last 3 or 4. But it's 3 issues. It's affordability, it's crime, and it's housing. So those issues are hurting. People are feeling a lot of pain right now. And marketing, which we do a lot of as well, we always talk about talking about the customer's pain. can you identify pain points and resonate and empathize with that pain? And Pierre's done a very good job of resonating with the pain of people that can't afford a new home. If you watch a lot of his speeches, it's all about stories of, the mom in this part of Ontario and this person in BC that can't afford groceries. They have to choose between groceries and paying their rent because of this affordability crisis. And then he puts all the blame right on the prime minister. And 8 years is a long time in power. And it's a very difficult message for the Liberals to counteract. So especially on the housing issue, with which the Liberals have said, okay, well, we got to do something about housing now. We realize we haven't done too much. And now, they launched this big campaign to get going on housing. And it's kind of falling flat because it's sort of the same old message and there's nothing new there. And Pierre actually has some pretty interesting new ideas. So it's really getting hard for the Liberals to counteract this message from Poilievre.
Yeah, and we don't know when the next election is. I think as we've seen the drop in the polls here, people are starting to push out their prediction on when we could see an election. I know if I was the prime minister, I wouldn't be thinking election here right now. But we're going to have to see a bit of a transition, aren't we, in the Conservative camp, where they start to outline here, okay, we can only criticize and tell stories for so long about the issues with housing and affordability, but here's our solutions. We necessarily haven't got to that step yet. When, from your political experience in advising candidates, when does that come?
It's mostly in an election campaign, to be honest. That's when you unveil your platform. Every day should be a new announcement in an election campaign. But Pierre's actually outlined quite a few different policies if you look at it. He has great policies on housing. He has great policies on affordability. They're actually very clear, very snappy what's going to happen. And even on crime and different things, Indigenous-led, resource sector jobs, he actually has a lot of policy that he's outlined. People don't see that, though. They see, the big headlines, and then during an election campaign, they actually really do pay attention to the policy. But if you actually go through social media feeds, there's quite a lot of policy there already. But it's more casting the vision than it is about specific policy right now. And I think where Poilievre is really winning is people like his vision for the country. This whole idea that, we can't have this strong country and have strong paychecks here and have affordable housing. He has kind of this one line he talks about where it's like, we have so much room, but we have so few houses because we're so scared of building. We can't build anything in the nation anymore. And people are like, well, Canada, we should be a building nation. Why aren't we building anymore? We've been kind of caught up in this wokeism and people slowing down investment, and people are sick of it, to be frank. And he's empathizing with our pain. And I think that's where you get a lot of the political support from.
Do you think there's any concern in Ontario? Doug Ford, premier there, Conservative premier, has had some struggles as of late, especially as it applies to the Greenbelt strategy. Does that at all, some of his issues, does it hurt Poilievre at all?
Not really. I don't think so. You actually saw a Leger poll came out today. I'm looking at it right now. It's the Conservatives at 45% in Ontario, Liberals only at 28%, which, this is a new poll only out a couple hours ago. That is huge. That hasn't been seen. I don't think even in Harper days when he won his big majority, they had that there. So people are going to, they were sort of joking about the polls for a while. It's like, oh, that's just fake. It's a flash in the pan. But Leger is one of the best pollsters in Canada, and you can't really ignore this anymore. So as a Liberal Party, you have to think, okay, what do we do here now? Trudeau's been our guy for a long time. He's led to a lot of success for our party. What do we do? And you don't really see a lot of the knives out yet. We haven't heard a lot about, somebody new sort of coming up and maybe stabbing the prime minister in the back and taking the reins of power. Chrystia Freeland's there. There's others that are around, but they don't seem to really be positioning themselves. If you actually remember Poilievre, he really positioned himself well and sort of campaigned as Erin O'Toole was going out. He was starting to ramp up his social media following, lots of videos. Yeah. And so you sort of saw, he wasn't intentionally stabbing Erin O'Toole in the back, but he was positioning himself knowing that this was a likely possibility. Doesn't seem like that's happening in Liberal ranks yet. But over the next 1 or 2 months, if these polling numbers keep up, those knives are going to start to come up.
We've also got an election. Before I move on to the Manitoba election, Quebec is the void, but if he's got BC, if Poilievre has BC and Ontario support, he almost doesn't even need Quebec, does he?
Correct. Yes, that was the Harper formula that worked. Harper never really won more than maybe it was 10 or 12 seats in Quebec. You don't really need it if you have enough support in Ontario and BC.
Okay.
And so the biggest shift is Ontario for the Conservatives, but also BC. People are really surprised. Conservatives have a lot of support in Vancouver, which is really odd. But you think of, again, the issues that Pierre's talking about here: affordability, housing, crime. Those are the biggest issues in Vancouver. It's so unaffordable in Vancouver to live, let alone buy a house. You can't even do that. And the crime rate in downtown Vancouver, like a lot of downtowns, is atrocious. And people are upset. They want solutions to this. And the same old ain't doing it anymore. So people want something different.
Manitoba election. Things are getting heated over there. It's wow. The gloves are off. Yeah, the gloves are off. And Stephenson seems to be in some trouble here as she goes against Mr. Canoe. So what do we make of this?
So the dogfight, you have two fairly unpopular leaders. Heather Stephenson has been the most unpopular premier in Canada for quite some time now. Never really differentiated herself from the previous administration of Brian Pallister. So that was a big issue. Hasn't been seen as an effective politician overall. And Wab Kinew also has a very checkered past. A number of different issues. He used to be a rap artist back in the day, and he's had a long history of domestic abuse, assault, racist rap lyrics. Like, there's a lot of things in his past that has been brought up over the years. Now, Wab Kinew is still a fairly effective politician, but a lot of that stuff's dragged him down. The NDP record also isn't very good in Manitoba. People don't like what was done in the past. So you have sort of two unpopular leaders where it seems to be trending NDP there. Stephenson has been, around for a bit, but the stink from the previous administration is still very much on her. She never really got that off of her back. And so Wab Kinew may end up winning this thing, but it is, fairly tight in the polls. NDP with a bit of an edge, especially in Winnipeg. It's all important in Winnipeg. So how Manitoba is structured is you have the NDP in the north, very strong, North Manitoba. Southern Manitoba, the PCs are very strong in rural areas. And then you have, really one big city in Manitoba, which is Winnipeg. And the NDP are leading there. And so the PCs are expected to get some of the more suburban areas, but not all of them, but maybe not enough to hang on. So it is very tight there. And that's why you see it being a dogfight in the last days. The attack ads start coming up.
Yeah, the knives are out. I saw one ad where it was throw away the NDP cards or something like that. And it basically showed some of the past of some of the people that are running on the NDP side and not being very kind, to put it lightly. Does Manitoba, like we just talked about some of the federal issues, affordability, crime, housing, are those issues that are going to resonate in this election?
Yeah, crime is one in Winnipeg that a lot of people talked about. That's certainly an issue there. Affordability is across the country, so that's a big one. Housing affordability, probably not as bad in Manitoba as it is elsewhere. Winnipeg would still have affordability issues with housing. But there's been a lot. So the NDP's main strategy has been healthcare. Their whole message is fix healthcare. That's pretty much all they're talking about. They've talked a little bit about crime. And the Stephenson's crew has talked more about crime, but mostly the economy and growth. Okay. And so they have this vision 2030 to grow the population, grow the economy, and keep growing jobs. So they're sort of running on their economic record a bit, keeping taxes low, that type of thing. But then there's also been some odd issues that have been brought up in the past week. And for me as a political strategist, it sort of shocks me to bring up these issues as advanced polls have already opened. So the one is they brought up the idea that there's never going to be a COVID lockdown again, which I was surprised at. They spent a whole day on it. And, I don't think you want to remind people of that past and that history, because it was their government that locked everybody down. So that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And then there's this landfill search issue that's happening. Yes. So I know you mentioned that to me off camera, but it's basically the idea of these two Indigenous women. People think their remains are in the landfill that were killed by a serial killer. And so people want it searched to find their remains and get some closure on this, which is, fair enough. So, but, the PCs are saying it is not worth the money and the search for this. And other people are saying, well, where's your compassion? Where's your sympathy? We have to get closure for these people. We got to find out what happened here. But it costs a lot of money. So there's a lot of political posturing there. I think there's some, they call it a wedge issue in politics, but I don't know if it's a good one in the last week of a campaign either to be talking about. I think people are more interested in pocketbook issues, healthcare, the economy, their job. Can I afford a house? They're not so much concerned about who's going to search the landfill.
And she's led with that in one of the debates. Like she led with that as her number one question. That just it seems like a question you get to, not one you would lead with.
Yeah, so they must think it's a winner in some ways. I saw some polling on it. It looked like it was pretty split across the province. So some people feel very passionate about it on both sides.
Yeah.
So that's why, a wedge issue is good. You're trying to wedge the party somewhere else. And hopefully your side of the wedge that you're on is the winning side. And I guess they're making the bet that they're on the winning side of that one, which I don't know is the case. But you look at the whole province, it's just split, Sean. Like if the NDP do win a majority, they need 29 seats. They're projected right now to win 29 seats. So that would be a very small majority. You also have a couple of Liberals that could potentially get elected in there in Winnipeg. And so the Liberals could potentially hold the balance of power in some sort of minority situation in Manitoba. If the PCs got in again, I think that would mean that the NDP's get out the vote strategy has pretty much collapsed and they didn't have the volunteers that they needed. So I think this one's pretty tough to call, certainly trending towards NDP. But I guess we'll see on Tuesday when we have election day.
Yeah, we will watch with a lot of anticipation and interest for sure. We've been talking to Derek Robinson. He is CEO of Mass Strategy based out of Calgary, Alberta. Derek, thanks a lot for joining us here today on RealAg Politics.
Thanks, Mr. Rainey.
And we move on to our last guest here on RealAg Politics. We're talking to Dave Carey. He is VP of Government and Industry Relations with the CCGA. Dave, welcome.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, okay. Dave, we're going to get into Bill C-234 here in a second, but I want to hit on, I think it was on LinkedIn that I saw it, CCGA putting out a post talking about, I think it was the 6 areas of growth and focus as you move ahead here as Parliament returns to Ottawa. 1, biofuels, 2, environment and sustainability, 3, trade and market diversification, 4, regulatory modernization, 5, managing risk on the farm, and 6, rail transportation. You got a lot of work ahead of you, bud.
Yeah, thanks. What we try to do is every summer when things are relatively quiet is to update our advocacy material for the following fall-winter. So we, create a brochure, a pamphlet that we can distribute to parliamentarians in advance of our meetings. It has to be written in a way that has some staying power because we won't update it again until next August. So those are the sort of 6 buckets that I'd say that we are prioritizing. However, often a lot of what we do in government relations is reactive. So it really depends on where the government is on certain policies, certain files, where legislation is that sort of dictate where the emphasis is placed in a given time. So that's something that is an evergreen document, but has a bit of staying power. So we're never tackling all 6 at once, or if we are, how you approach them really depends on where the policy, regulation, legislation sort of is in process, as far as, the amount of time you spend on it or who you're engaging with it on.
Yeah, well, and I would always expect rail transportation to be on there because that's always an issue when it comes to specifically Western Canadian agriculture for sure. What are you trying to accomplish on the biofuels front?
Yeah, the biofuels file, we're sort of, in some ways, kind of wrapping up some of the heavy lift on there. We're wanting to make sure that as they bring in regulations that it is not onerous or burdensome on farmers. So we are sort of at the point of sort of closing that out from an advocacy perspective. As you said, Sean, rail is a perennial topic. However, it's going to be even more so this fall because there's sort of things coalescing. The Budget Implementation Act, we did get an 18-month pilot project for extended interswitching in the prairies. However, Transport Canada has now announced a full kind of review of rail transportation in Canada. So everything from MRE to interswitching to grain and winter plans. So that'll be, I'd say, even bigger focused. It is a perennial file for us, but a bigger focus because the federal government has decided to consult on it beginning in next month in October. Therefore, it becomes an even more front burner issue because there's a formal mechanism to engage with the federal government on it. So as opposed to just speaking about it, there's actually a mechanism, a consultation process to go through that. So rail will be probably an even bigger focus than we had thought. But again, the federal government decided to move on a review. Therefore, we have to react to that in the interest of Western Canadian canola farmers.
Trade and market diversification. You're sitting down from Trade Minister Ng. Let's just pretend right now. What are you pushing for?
Well, one was we were very supportive of the federal government's move to create an Indo-Pacific Agriculture and Agri-Food Office that will be housed in Manila. The first tranche of federal public servants are actually being deployed this fall. The whole idea around that is we have excellent trade commissioners. We have excellent negotiators. What we don't have is in that kind of burgeoning market in the Indo-Pacific region, technical expertise from our federal government on the ground. Australia does, the UK does, the United States does, and now we will. So that's been a huge push as we look at the Indo-Pacific region being probably the burgeoning market for agriculture products with a growing middle class, rising education levels, rising disposable income. They want Canadian products. So it's not so much the market access side, it's that we need to have plant pathologists, entomologists, veterinarians overseas so that they can walk local regulators through what that looks like and how we can resolve trade issues. With ministering too, I think a real support on market diversification. We're continuing to the negotiations with ASEAN. And of course, I would be remiss if I was in the meeting with ministering. We would continue to flag our concern with Private Members Bill C-282, which, while it's in the Senate remit now, is still a concern because on one hand, we're opening up markets for the Indo-Pacific, and on the other hand, we're talking about legislation to tie the hands of negotiators. So I'd be remiss if I did not raise that with ministering if I had the opportunity.
Yeah, also curious, we've heard a lot from pork and beef about the concerns about the UK joining the CPTPP. What's the canola industry's position on this happening?
Yeah, I mean, great question. I think the UK is not a market for canola. It just isn't. They have their own domestic rapeseed market. However, from a broader sort of trade policy perspective, public policy perspective, very concerned. Concerned as CCJ, 90% of the canola grown in Canada is exported. Also concerned, wearing my hat as an executive board member with CAFTA, representing 90% of the food exported. The concern there, Sean, is our own negotiators cited concerns that they had with the United Kingdom's ability to meet scientific rigor, their ability to meet our sanitary and phytosanitary standards. So what do we have for leverage? The leverage that we have is they want to join the CPTPP. That is the gold standard. That is a Rolls Royce of trade agreements. We've told other countries that want to join, you can't join unless you can meet the high standards. The CPTPP is the most progressive and comprehensive trade deal that we have in the books. Allowing the UK to accede before we've got our own bilateral house in order reduces our leverage down the road to then fix those bilateral issues. So while it's not a priority market for canola, when it comes to wearing my CAFTA hat, pork and cattle are our members, and we certainly take that fight to bear. CCJ, we're not actively working on that file, just given canola is not a market. But the concern from just a public policy perspective, any trade negotiator knows leverage is everything. So allowing them to join the CPTPP, then hoping down the road we got our own bilateral sorted out, that should have been reversed, that order. We got a bilateral and then the CPTPP sorted out.
Before we move on, Dave, biofuels, I just want to go back to that for a second. The Conservatives have been really hitting the CFR, the Clean Fuel Regulation, hard with not putting out necessarily an alternative biofuel strategy. Are you concerned at all that these two things are really lumped together and we're not hearing kind of an alternative?
Well, I mean, I think the opposition parties are, bringing forth the concerns they're hearing from constituents around cost of living and affordability and rising prices, and we don't really see, an end to, anyone with a variable mortgage can attest to the kind of roller coaster that is these days. Yeah. I don't think it's their concerns of CFI are really presented with any kind of nuance, right, around what are the concerns with the clean fuel regulation specifically. I think where we're at, Sean, we have a big concern from the opposition around the consumer carbon tax on top of things like the clean fuel regulations. I think if we didn't have the same, pressures from the consumer-facing carbon tax, they would probably view biofuels and clean fuel rate in a different light because it's more of the industrial side, right? It's companies generating carbon credits. It's a way to, instead of export raw canola, we value add, crush, process here, create those jobs here. So I think it's politics. It's minority government. Everyone's positioning for likely I would suspect the next federal budget triggers the election. So spring 2024 would be my crystal ball. So of course they're making political hay. There isn't really an alternative. Conservatives are working on their platform, but I think it's just a combination of affordability and rising inflation and rising interest rates. CFR it's an additive thing. It's a kind of another straw and on that proverbial camel's back. So, so I think as we see the Conservatives go along, we'll have to see a kind of, is there concern consumer-facing carbon pricing? Is it the industrial side of carbon pricing, which there is, a market for on the biofuel side, and try to square that peg? And I'm sure they will, but at this point, it's I think they just view any additional cost as just a bridge too far.
Great perspective there. Okay. Bill C-234. We talked to Debra Conlon from the Grain Farmers of Ontario a little bit earlier on here in the show. You were in front of the Senate Ag Committee on Tuesday night of this week, providing your perspective from the points of CCGA. I guess, is this one going to happen? Is there obstacles in its way? What's your synopsis?
Yeah, thanks. So I was there Tuesday evening. Actually, my role is a co-chair of the Agriculture Carbon Alliance, which is 15 national farm organizations working together on this file. And that would range from supply management to grains and oilseeds, cattle, pork, fruit and veg, and everyone in between. We've come a long ways in this because we were involved, ACA, we're involved in this bill's inception, from helping draft the legislation to shepherding it through the House of Commons, through a click and submit campaign and multiple committee appearances. And last night, my co-chair, Scott Ross, and I from the Canadian Federation of Agriculture appeared for ACA. Very good discussion. I think what we've seen is initially at second reading in the Senate, a lot of concerns around double dipping. We have Bill C-8 and there are rebates available for farmers. We know those rebates don't work. We know they get a pittance back relative to what they spend. We know there's no sensitivity with Bill C-8 because it looks at operating costs, not anything to do with the actual natural gas or propane they're using. We also saw, I think, a wholesome discussion around concerns this is a slippery slope and the next industry is going to want a carbon tax exemption. And I think what we really positioned it, Sean, is when the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act was brought in, there was a recognition that farmers have a critical role to play, and gasoline and diesel were exempted. So farmers do not pay for gasoline and diesel used on farm. So all we're trying to do, we're not trying to present the philosophical scrap the carbon tax. That's for the opposition to do. We're here kind of realistic, pragmatic to say, all we're asking for is for on-farm uses, natural gas and propane should be exempt. For the same reasons that gasoline and diesel were initially exempt. They should be exempt for the following practices: grain drying, heating and cooling of livestock barns and greenhouses, irrigation, and feed preparation. Those activities on farm should be exempt. And we've actually seen, I think, the narrative move quite a bit as they've actually heard from Finance Canada officials. The way it's structured, farmers are never supposed to be made whole. It's an aggregate approach. And so I think a lot of this sort of misinformation or incorrect information that was out there at second reading has sort of come to light through the committee process. And we're excited that this Thursday, or this week, the Parliamentary Budget Officer will be at committee to speak to a lot of the things that we pointed to, such as even if we've carbon taxed at its full $170 a ton, it will reduce agriculture emissions by 1%. But it will cost, and we now have the costing of it, if we're able to get Bill 234 passed, Sean, between the time it gets royal assent and it's 8 years that it has a sunset clause attached to it, and that's what was required for support from the Bloc and NDP and Green Party in the House, almost $1 billion of financial relief for farmers. Something like $975 million will remain in farmers' pockets if Bill C-234 is successful. And this is not about a slippery slope. This is about just tidying up those exemptions that should have already existed that gasoline and diesel enjoy, adding natural gas and propane on farm. And that's a $975 million, not even a return to farmers. It just remains with them so that they can reinvest in their operations and really explain to senators that when farmers find efficiencies on farm, those are economic and environmental, and they go hand in hand.
And the part that has always confused me about all this is there's no alternative, right? Grain drying. We're not making solar powered grain dryers. When it comes to the heating of livestock barns, I've been in Ontario a lot during the winter season. There's not a lot of sun time. There's a lot of cloud. So you're not heating those barns with solar panels. And so this becomes just, there's no other option for farmers, and they're just incurring this cost. And at a time where there's so much concern about food prices, it doesn't match what we're actually doing here in practicality with the carbon tax not having these exemptions that 234 is seeking out.
And then that's it. And I think a lot of the discussion, and you touched on the livestock, and I'm glad. I mean, as CCJ, we focus on the grain drying and irrigation. But as ACA, we focus on all the kind of practical uses that 234 would be applied to. And you're right. Yeah, I mean, we have 70 degrees centigrade swings in temperature, from minus 35 to plus 35. Canada is a large country. It's a country that has a huge change in weather patterns. So I think, unfortunately, because of the discussion around groceries and inflation, it is in some ways helping the 234 argument, right? Around this does make sense. Farmers aren't producing widgets; they're growing food, feed, fuel, fiber. That our stocks our grocery store shelves and feeds our exports to the world. So cautiously optimistic that this bill could be referred back to the Senate for third reading as early as end of next week or the week after. And then, as far as we are optimistic about it passing, I will say, I think we as ACA have met with about a quarter of the Senate now about this bill. And most senators have just good, valid questions that once we meet and explain, they seem to understand that this is not a philosophical argument. This is just about helping farmers, producers, and ranchers do what they do best. And this is, as you said, it's not only that there's no viable alternatives, which is true, the infrastructure as well, but it's also when farmers don't have money, they don't invest. So taking money in their pockets and returning it 18 months later, hopefully through a rebate, farmers aren't investing in the next technology, the next piece of equipment. Maybe, and for some farmers, maybe an anaerobic digester or solar panels work depending on where you are. But if you don't have money, you can't try new things on farm. So I think government tries to usually do blanket policies that help everyone. And I think we all know that every farm is different. Every farmer, every producer is different. That money should be left in their pockets to reinvest in their operations as they see fit to find those efficiencies.
And I was doing a mainstream news interview earlier today about this. I was asked about it, and I'll ask you about it too, but there's confusion. Why is Minister McCauley standing up in the House of Commons and saying that farmers support the carbon tax? What is that? Where is he hearing that from?
I don't know who he'd be hearing that from, which farmer would say that they support that. I think we're hearing significant concerns from farmers about whether it's rising input costs, whether it is farmers are subject to the same inflationary pressures we all are when they go to the grocery store. Their kids want to participate in activities, or they're looking at land prices or whatever it might be. And I think, so I don't know why the minister would characterize that, because I've certainly not ever really spoken to a farmer that supports that. There's certainly farmers that support the biofuel market. That's a very small portion of it. But I would say that the concern that we also have is that Bill 234 will provide a significant exemption. However, we do know that every April 1, when the price of carbon increases, their price of inputs go up, whether that's seed, fertilizer, their price of fuel goes up, their cost of trucking goes up. Their cost of freight and rail goes up. Everything goes up. And so 234 is just a private member's bill has to be, it's like a scalpel. It's surgical. It has to be it can only ponder one act. It can only make minor, tweaks and changes. 234 is the most pragmatic, realistic tool that we have available us to provide the most meaningful benefits to farmers. So I actually miss Minister McCauley, offering those comments. I would be surprised if he would offer that same line of reasoning in a room full of farmers or farm groups or agriculture industry organizations, because this is Bill 234 is one of the biggest priorities for every national farm group right now, ours included, which is why we're very, very optimistic that at third reading, the Senate will see the reason for this and that they'll pass into law and that we'll receive royal assent this calendar year.
Yeah, well put. We've been talking to Dave Carey. He's VP of Government and Industry Relations with the CCGA based out of Ottawa. Hey, Dave, thanks a lot for joining us here today on RealAg Politics.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
Hope you enjoyed today's episode of RealAg Politics. Again, if there's anything you heard today that you agree with, that bothers you, maybe you have additional questions, you can always reach out to us. Leave a comment in the comment box below, or of course, you can send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com, or you can call the RealAg feedback line, 855-776-6147. Of course, today's show was pre-recorded. We're hoping to do some live broadcasts again in the future, so stay tuned for that and keep that feedback coming, everybody. Thank you so much for getting real and getting connected with Real Agriculture.